The church bells had barely stopped ringing when Miss Marple noticed something no one else had seen. At the funeral of wealthy Mr. Blackwood, every person he had invited was there, except one. But the missing guest wasn't simply late. Miss Marple quietly looked toward the coffin and whispered, "That is the person who should be most afraid." By sunset, one suspect would be exposed, one secret would be uncovered, and the quiet village of St. Mary Mead would learn that the dead man had left behind one final clue. Chapter 1. The Missing Guest. The church bells of St. Mary Mead had finished their mournful ringing, yet the village seemed unable to return to its ordinary rhythm. A cold November mist lay over the narrow lanes, softening the outlines of cottages and turning the bare branches of the elms into black fingers against the pale sky. Inside the little church of St. Mary, the last mourners were gathering beneath the gas lamps, their dark coats and veiled hats forming a solemn procession around the coffin of Mr. Reginald Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood had been wealthy, respected, and, according to some, deeply disliked. He owned Blackwood Manor on the edge of the village, several properties in London, and enough money to make enemies without ever knowing their names. His death, 3 days earlier, had been officially recorded as heart failure. There had been no suspicion of murder, no struggle, and no missing valuables. Yet as the funeral ended, Miss Jane Marple stood quietly near the church door, watching the mourners rather than the coffin. She was a small, elderly woman with silver hair and an expression that suggested harmless curiosity. To those who did not know her, she appeared merely interested in village gossip, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and human nature, she often said, changed remarkably little from one village to another. As the mourners stepped into the fog, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Everyone who had been expected at the funeral was present, everyone except one person, and that person, she thought, should have been standing closest to the coffin. The first person to leave was Mr. Edward Blackwood, the dead man's nephew and heir. He was a tall young man with neatly combed dark hair, an expensive black coat, and a face that looked considerably more relieved than grief-stricken. He shook hands with the vicar, thanked him mechanically, and hurried toward his waiting motor car. Behind him came Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the widow. She moved slowly, supported by a walking stick, her black veil covering most of her face. She had been married to Reginald for 26 years, though village gossip suggested that the marriage had been unhappy for at least 20 of them. Then came Dr. Henry Carter, the family physician. He had signed Mr. Blackwood's death certificate. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He avoided looking at the widow. That in itself was interesting. A fourth mourner was Miss Clara Finch, Mr. Blackwood's secretary. She was a nervous young woman whose gloved fingers repeatedly tightened around the handle of her umbrella. She looked toward the manor several times, as though expecting someone to emerge from the fog. There was also Mr. Arthur Bell, Blackwood's solicitor, who carried a leather briefcase tightly against his chest. And finally, Mrs. Agnes Price, the housekeeper, who had served at Blackwood Manor for more than 30 years. 6 people, 6 expected mourners, but 7 names appeared on the funeral arrangements. Miss Marple knew this because she had seen the list herself. The 7th name was Mr. Thomas Reed. A small ember, perhaps, but it glowed. Miss Marple approached the vicar as the last mourners disappeared through the churchyard gate. "Reverend Peters," she said gently, "was Mr. Reed unable to attend?" The vicar looked puzzled. "Mr. Reed?" "Yes, Thomas Reed." The vicar's expression changed. For a moment, he seemed uncomfortable. "I had expected him," he admitted. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood specifically mentioned him when we arranged the service. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did he? Yes, 3 days before his death. The old lady's eyes sharpened. And what exactly did Mr. Blackwood say? The vicar hesitated. He said, "If Thomas Reed comes to my funeral, make certain you speak to him before anyone else does." Miss Marple was silent. The wind moved through the churchyard, scattering a few dead leaves across the wet stones. Did Mr. Reed have any connection with the family? "I believe so," said the vicar, "though I confess I never understood the relationship." Neither did Miss Marple, but she intended to. As she walked slowly toward the village, she passed Blackwood Manor in the distance. Its tall windows were dark beneath the gray afternoon sky. A single chimney sent smoke upward, but somehow the house looked less like a home than a fortress. Miss Marple stopped. There was something else. Something she had noticed during the funeral, a muddy footprint. It had been partly hidden beside the church gate, where the mourners had gathered. Most people would have ignored it, but Miss Marple had spent enough time watching village paths to know that the mud was unusual. The churchyard soil was dark brown. This mud was pale and reddish. She bent slightly to examine it. "Clay," she murmured. Then she noticed something caught in the mud, a tiny fragment of blue wool. Miss Marple carefully straightened. The ember had become warmer. She knew the 6 mourners, or at least their circumstances. Mr. Edward Blackwood had inherited everything. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had been married to the dead man. Dr. Carter had declared the death natural. Miss Finch knew the family's secrets. Mr. Bell controlled the legal affairs, and Mrs. Price had known everything that happened inside Blackwood Manor. But Thomas Reed, the missing guest, was the only person whose absence had not been explained. Miss Marple continued toward the village, her shoes making soft sounds against the damp pavement. At the corner near the post office, she encountered Mr. Edward Blackwood. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marple." "Mr. Blackwood, you were looking for someone at the church." She smiled. "Was I?" "Thomas Reed." The words came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. "Do you know where he is?" Edward's face tightened. "No." "Did your uncle know?" "Yes." "And did your uncle expect him at the funeral?" Edward looked toward Blackwood Manor. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he lowered his voice. "My uncle was afraid of him. That was unexpected." "Afraid?" Edward nodded. "He received a letter from Reed the night before he died." "What did the letter say?" "I don't know." "Did your uncle tell you?" "No." Miss Marple studied him. "Then how do you know there was a letter?" Edward's face went pale. The question had caught him. "I saw it." "Where?" "On his desk." "And where is it now?" Edward looked directly at her. "It is gone." The fog seemed suddenly colder. Miss Marple smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." She walked away. Behind her, Edward remained motionless. Miss Marple did not turn around, but she could feel his eyes following her. By the time she reached her cottage, she had formed no conclusion. That was important. A good detective did not decide too early. She sat beside the fire and placed the tiny piece of blue wool on a sheet of white paper. Blue wool, a missing guest, a vanished letter, and a dead man who had apparently expected someone to attend his funeral. Miss Marple stared into the flames. "A small ember," she whispered, "but it glows with meaning." Outside, the church bell struck 5, and somewhere beyond the village, hidden behind the fog, a man named Thomas Reed was still alive. At least, Miss Marple hoped he was. Because if he was not, then the funeral had not been missing a guest. It had been missing the murderer. Chapter 2. Gathering Kindling. The morning after Mr. Reginald Blackwood's funeral arrived beneath a sky the color of old pewter. A thin rain tapped against the windows of Miss Marple's cottage, while the village streets remained unusually quiet, as though St. Mary Mead itself were reluctant to discuss what had happened. Miss Marple, seated beside her little coal fire with a cup of tea warming her hands, had spent the early hours arranging the facts in her mind. There were 6 mourners at the funeral, Yet a seventh name had appeared on the arrangements. Thomas Reed had been expected, and Mr. Blackwood had apparently feared his arrival. More curious still, a letter from Reed had vanished from the dead man's desk. Miss Marple had learned long ago that when three apparently unrelated facts gathered together, they were rarely unrelated at all. At 9:30, the sound of a motor car disturbed the quiet lane. Dr. Henry Carter had come to see her. He removed his wet hat as he entered and accepted the chair she offered him. His normally confident expression appeared strained, and Miss Marple noticed that his right hand trembled slightly when he placed his gloves upon his knee. "I thought you might wish to speak with me," he said. "How kind of you, Doctor. I understand you have been asking questions about Mr. Reed." Miss Marple smiled. People in villages notice when someone fails to attend a funeral. Dr. Carter looked toward the fire. "Thomas Reed is not a man I would advise you to become involved with." "That sounds rather serious." "It is." The doctor lowered his voice. "Reed worked for Mr. Blackwood years ago. They had a disagreement. Reed left the estate under unpleasant circumstances. Was he dismissed?" "Yes." "For stealing?" "No." Miss Marple waited. Dr. Carter sighed. "Reed claimed Mr. Blackwood had cheated him. That is quite different." "I know. Did you believe him?" The doctor hesitated. "I believed that Mr. Blackwood was capable of many things. There was an ember." Miss Marple carefully added it to the growing pile. "What exactly happened between them?" "I cannot tell you everything, because you do not know, because some matters are better left buried." Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "People often say that about secrets, Doctor. Unfortunately, secrets have a habit of digging themselves out." For the first time, Dr. Carter smiled, but it was not a comfortable smile. Before leaving, he said one final thing. "Miss Marple, if anyone asks, I was here for 10 minutes." She looked at the clock. "You have been here 23. The doctor's face changed. He stood immediately. "I must go." After he had left, Miss Marple remained beside the fire. Why had a doctor who had signed a death certificate been so concerned about how long he had remained in her cottage? A small ember, she wondered what it would ignite. By noon, another visitor arrived. It was Clara Finch, Mr. Blackwood's secretary. The young woman entered carrying a small handbag and wearing the same nervous expression she had worn at the funeral. She sat stiffly, refusing tea, until Miss Marple insisted. "I should not really have come," Clara said. "Then I am especially glad you did." Clara looked toward the window. "I think Mr. Blackwood was murdered." Miss Marple did not react. "That is a serious accusation." "I know. Why do you believe it?" "Because of the night he died." Clara's fingers tightened around her handbag. "He was perfectly well at dinner. He complained about indigestion, but he was walking around the house. At 11 o'clock, I brought him some papers to sign. And? He told me to leave. Was he alone?" "No." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Who was with him?" Clara swallowed. "Mrs. Blackwood. That was interesting. Did you hear anything?" "A few minutes later, I heard shouting." "What kind?" "I could not make out the words." "Male or female?" "Both." Clara's voice became quieter. Then there was a crash. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "What happened afterward?" "I waited outside the library. Mrs. Blackwood came out first." "Was she frightened?" "No." "Angry?" "Yes." "And Mr. Blackwood? I heard him say something." "What?" Clara stared at the floor. "He said, 'Thomas knows the truth.'" The room seemed suddenly colder. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Did Mrs. Blackwood hear him?" "I think so." "Where is the letter from Thomas Reed?" Clara looked startled. "I don't know." "You knew there was a letter?" "Yes." "Why did you not tell me before?" "Because Mr. Bell warned me." "The solicitor?" Clara nodded. "He said that if the police became involved, I could lose my position." Miss Marple regarded her for several seconds. "And what else did Mr. Bell tell you?" Clara whispered. He said Thomas Reed had been dead for 10 years. The fire cracked sharply. Miss Marple did not move. "Dead?" "That is what Mr. Bell said. But someone sent Mr. Blackwood a letter signed by Thomas Reed." "I know. And someone expected Thomas Reed at the funeral." Clara nodded. Miss Marple slowly leaned back. Now the embers were beginning to glow. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Blackwood Manor. The great house stood behind iron gates, its stone walls darkened by rain. Bare rose bushes clung to the garden walls, while smoke drifted from the chimneys into the heavy fog. A gardener in a patched coat hurried past her without speaking, and somewhere inside the house a clock chimed 3. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood received her in the drawing-room. She wore black silk and held herself with remarkable composure. "Miss Marple," she said, "I understand you have been asking questions. Only small ones. There are no small questions where my husband's death is concerned." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite so." She looked around the room. A large portrait of Reginald Blackwood hung above the fireplace. His painted eyes seemed cold and watchful. "Your husband was afraid of Thomas Reed?" Mrs. Blackwood's expression did not change. "My husband feared no man." "Then perhaps he simply disliked him." "He despised him." "Why?" "Because Reed was a liar." "Yet your husband mentioned him before he died." "I was not aware of that." "Miss Finch says there was an argument between you and your husband on the night he died." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes hardened. "Miss Finch is young. Young people misunderstand things. Did you argue?" "Yes." "About Thomas Reed?" A pause. "Yes." "And what was the argument about?" Mrs. Blackwood stood. "I believe this conversation is over." Miss Marple rose politely. "Of course." As she turned toward the door, she noticed something on the writing desk. A small brass letter opener. Beside it lay several torn pieces of paper. Miss Marple glanced at them. "May I?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple smiled. Of course not. But she had already seen enough. One torn fragment contained 3 words, "At the funeral." Another contained, "You promised," and the final fragment showed only a single letter, T. Outside Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple paused beneath the dripping branches. She had entered the house, believing she was investigating a missing guest. She left, believing she was investigating a secret. And perhaps, she thought, the secret was older than the dead man himself. That evening, a telegram arrived at her cottage. It contained only 7 words. "Do not look for Thomas Reed. He is dead." There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she noticed the postmark. It had not been sent from St. Mary Mead. It had been sent from London. She placed the telegram beside the blue wool fragment. 2 small embers, a vanished letter, a warning from London, and a man officially dead for 10 years who had supposedly written a letter 3 days before a funeral. Miss Marple stirred the fire. "The kindling is gathering," she murmured. Outside, the fog thickened over St. Mary Mead. And somewhere in London, someone who had been watching the investigation had just made one very serious mistake. They had warned Miss Marple to stop looking. She had never been particularly good at obeying warnings. Chapter 3. The Smolder. The rain had stopped by morning, but the fog remained over St. Mary Mead like a gray curtain that refused to rise. Miss Marple sat beside her window with the anonymous telegram spread before her, the paper already softened from being handled too many times. The words were simple. "Do not look for Thomas Reed. He is dead." Yet they had created more questions than answers. Miss Marple had learned that a lie was rarely dangerous because it was complicated. It was dangerous because it contained just enough truth to make the listener accept it. Thomas Reed might indeed have been dead, but if so, why had Mr. Blackwood expected him at his funeral? Why had a letter appeared bearing Reed's name? And why had someone in London become frightened enough to warn an elderly village woman away from the truth? By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple had made her decision. She would visit Mr. Arthur Bell. The solicitor's office stood above the village bank, reached by a narrow staircase smelling of damp wool, dust, and old paper. Gaslight still burned in the hallway despite the late morning hour, its faint hiss filling the silence. Mr. Bell received her behind a polished mahogany desk covered with ledgers, legal documents, and a silver letter opener. "You have been asking about Thomas Reed," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "I seem to have developed a reputation. You have developed a dangerous curiosity. Curiosity is rarely dangerous, Mr. Bell. It is what people do to prevent questions from being answered that tends to cause trouble." The solicitor's expression hardened. "I told Miss Finch not to involve herself. Yet she did. She is young. So was I once." For the first time, Bell looked almost amused. Then Miss Marple placed the telegram on his desk. "Someone in London appears very concerned about Mr. Reed." Bell read it. His face changed, only slightly. But Miss Marple saw it. A small ember, she thought, and it glows. "Where did you get this?" Bell asked. "The post. Who sent it? If I knew that, I should not have come to you." Bell folded the telegram and returned it. "Thomas Reed is dead. You have said that before. He died 10 years ago. How? A railway accident. Where? Manchester. Was the body identified?" Bell paused. "Yes." "By whom?" The solicitor looked irritated. "I do not see how that is relevant." "Neither do I," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Which is why I am asking." Bell stood and walked toward the window. He was identified by a former colleague. "Name? William Price." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Price?" "Yes." "Any relation to Agnes Price, the housekeeper?" Bell turned around. "I don't know." That answer was too quick. Miss Marple said nothing. Bell eventually continued. "Reed had been dismissed by Blackwood after stealing company documents." "What kind of documents?" "Financial records." "Did he steal them?" "I assume so." "You assume?" Bell sighed. "Mr. Blackwood believed he did. That is not the same thing." "No." Miss Marple gathered her handbag. Before leaving, she turned back. "One final question. Did Mr. Blackwood make a new will shortly before his death?" Bell froze. "Yes." "And who inherits?" "His nephew, Edward." "Only Edward?" "No." Miss Marple waited. Bell looked away. "There is another beneficiary." "Who?" The solicitor's silence was answer enough. Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Bell." She left without pressing him further. Outside, the village seemed brighter, though the fog still clung to the roofs. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the church, her thoughts moving faster than her feet. There were now several embers. Thomas Reed supposedly died 10 years ago. His body had been identified by a man named William Price. The Blackwood financial records had disappeared. Mr. Blackwood had recently changed his will, and there was another beneficiary whose identity Arthur Bell refused to reveal. The question was not merely who wanted Reginald Blackwood dead, it was what had happened 10 years earlier, because something had survived that railway accident. A secret, perhaps even a person. At the churchyard, Miss Marple found Reverend Peters tending the graves. "Reverend," she said, "do you remember Thomas Reed?" The vicar frowned. "I never knew him well." "Did he attend church?" "Years ago." "Was he married?" "Yes." "To whom?" "Elizabeth Reed." "Where is she now?" The vicar looked uncomfortable. "She left the village." "When?" 10 years ago." "Precisely." Within a month of Thomas's death, Miss Marple stood very still. A small ember had suddenly become warmer. "Did she have children?" "One daughter." "What was her name?" "Lucy." Miss Marple's heart gave a tiny leap. "Lucy Reed?" "Yes." "And where is she now?" The vicar shook his head. "I don't know." Miss Marple thanked him and walked away. She had encountered something similar once before. Years ago, there had been a village dispute involving two brothers who had both claimed ownership of a small farm. Everyone had focused on the father's final signature, arguing over whether it had been forged. But the truth had been found not in the document itself, but in the habits of the family. One brother always folded letters twice, the other folded them once. A supposedly forged letter had been folded twice. The detail had seemed absurd. It had solved the case. That was the trouble with human beings, Miss Marple often thought. They imagined themselves mysterious because their motives were complicated, yet their habits betrayed them constantly. A person might change a name, alter handwriting, invent an alibi, or disappear for 10 years, but they rarely changed the tiny habits they did not know they possessed. And somewhere in the Blackwood mystery was such a habit. Miss Marple was certain of it. By afternoon, she returned to Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Agnes Price answered the door. The housekeeper's face was pale when Miss Marple mentioned William Price. "Do you know him?" Miss Marple asked. "No." "You are certain?" "Yes." Miss Marple looked at her hands. They were trembling. "Mrs. Price, I did not say William Price was connected with you." The housekeeper stared at her. For several seconds neither woman spoke. Then Agnes whispered, "My brother died years ago." "Your brother?" "William." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "How did he die?" "Railway accident." "And was his body identified?" Agnes looked toward the hallway. "I don't want to talk about this. I understand." Miss Marple began to leave. Then Agnes caught her arm. "Please." Miss Marple turned. "Please don't look for Thomas Reed." "Why?" "Because some people do not want the past disturbed." "Who?" Agnes released her. "I cannot tell you." Before Miss Marple could reply, a sound came from upstairs. A door slammed. Both women looked up. Agnes went white. "That room is locked," she whispered. "What room?" "The library." Miss Marple looked toward the staircase. "Who is upstairs?" "I don't know." A floorboard creaked. Then another. Slow footsteps began descending. Miss Marple waited. A figure appeared at the top of the staircase. It was Edward Blackwood. He stopped when he saw her. For one long moment, nobody spoke. Then Edward said quietly, "You should not be here, Miss Marple." She smiled. "I am beginning to think that is precisely why I should." Edward descended the stairs. But Miss Marple was no longer looking at him. She was looking at his shoes. There was reddish clay on the soles. The same pale red clay she had found near the church, and caught in the mud was a tiny thread of blue wool. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The spark had become kindling. The kindling was beginning to smolder, and now she knew one thing with certainty. Edward Blackwood had been at the church after the funeral. But why? That was the question that would make the entire mystery catch fire. From such small embers, conflagrations grow. Chapter 4. Fanning the Flames. The discovery of reddish clay upon Edward Blackwood's shoes might have been enough to convince a less patient investigator, but Miss Marple was not interested in convenient conclusions. She had learned that the first suspect was often the person who had behaved most foolishly, while the real culprit remained quietly behind the curtain, so she merely smiled at Edward and stepped aside as though she had noticed nothing unusual. "I was looking for you," Edward said. "How fortunate." "I was looking for several people." His expression tightened. "Why?" "Oh, nothing important. I have simply become curious about your uncle's final days." Edward glanced toward the locked library door. "My uncle's death was a tragedy." "Indeed. And it was natural. Dr. Carter believes so." Edward stared at her. "Then there is no reason to continue this." Miss Marple looked at the reddish clay on his shoes again. "I quite agree." She walked toward the front door. Edward relaxed slightly. That was his mistake. Miss Marple had not asked him where he had been after the funeral. She had not asked why his shoes carried the same unusual clay found near the church, and she had not mentioned the blue wool thread caught beneath his heel. Instead, she asked a much simpler question. "Mr. Blackwood, did you attend the churchyard alone?" Edward stopped. "Yes." "At what time?" "Immediately after the funeral." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you return to the manor afterward?" "Yes. Thank you." She left. Outside, the afternoon fog had begun to lift, revealing patches of pale winter sunlight. Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her mind arranging the facts. Edward had lied. He had said he went directly home, yet his shoes suggested he had walked through the churchyard after the other mourners had gone. Why? The answer might have been hidden in the graveyard itself. So Miss Marple returned. The church was nearly empty now. A coal fire crackled faintly inside the vestry, and Reverend Peters was sorting hymn books. "I thought of something," Miss Marple said. "Something important." "Perhaps," she explained the clay. The vicar frowned. "That soil isn't from the churchyard." "I know. Where does it come from?" "That's what I hoped you might tell me." The vicar thought. "There is reddish clay near the old quarry road. Who uses that road?" "Very few people. The quarry has been closed for years." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Does it lead anywhere?" "To the railway embankment, the old railway line, the place where Thomas Reed had supposedly died." A flame seemed to flicker in Miss Marple's mind. "Thank you, Reverend." She left immediately. The quarry road lay beyond the eastern edge of the village, where the neat gardens of St. Mary Mead gave way to muddy fields and neglected hedges. By the time Miss Marple reached it, the afternoon had turned cold. Bare branches scratched against one another in the wind, and somewhere far away a train whistle echoed through the fog. She examined the ground. The clay was unmistakable, pale red, mixed with tiny black stones, exactly like the substance on Edward's shoes. But there was something else, a footprint, then another. The prints led toward the old railway embankment. Miss Marple followed them. At the top of the embankment stood a ruined signalman's hut. Its wooden door hung crookedly from one hinge. Inside, the air smelled of damp timber and soot. Someone had been there recently. There were cigarette ashes beside the cold fireplace, a newspaper dated 3 days earlier, and a blue wool scarf hanging from a nail. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely looked. The ember glowed. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Mr. Arthur Bell. The solicitor stood at the entrance, breathing heavily. "Miss Marple." "What a coincidence. You shouldn't be here." "I seem to hear that frequently." Bell stepped inside. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. Then perhaps you should explain it." He looked toward the blue scarf. His face became pale. "You found it." "I found several things." "Give me the scarf." "No." Bell's expression hardened. "Miss Marple, this is not a game." "No. Someone is dead." He lowered his voice. "Mr. Blackwood knew the truth about Thomas Reed. I believe that. And Reed's death was not what everyone thinks." Miss Marple remained silent. Bell continued. "The railway accident happened. A man died, but the identity of the body was never properly established. Yet you told me it was." I was repeating what I had been told. "By whom?" Bell looked away. "Mr. Blackwood." There it was. Another ember. Why would he lie? Because he was protecting someone. Who? Before Bell could answer, the sound of a motor car came from the road. Bell looked frightened. "We must leave." "Why?" "Because someone else knows we are here." Miss Marple heard the engine stop. A door slammed. Then footsteps approached the hut. Bell moved toward the rear exit. Miss Marple did not. A man's voice came through the fog. "Mr. Bell?" Bell froze. The voice was unfamiliar. Then another voice answered from outside. "Miss Marple!" It was Edward Blackwood. The door opened. Edward stood there with Dr. Carter. For several seconds, the three men looked at one another. Miss Marple smiled. "How extraordinary. We seem to have assembled nearly the entire cast." Edward's eyes moved toward Bell. "You told her?" Bell said nothing. Dr. Carter stepped forward. "You need to come back to the village." "Why?" "Because this place is dangerous." Miss Marple looked at him. "More dangerous than Blackwood Manor?" The doctor said nothing. She turned to Edward. "Where were you after the funeral?" Edward hesitated. "I told you. You told me you went home." "I did. Your shoes disagree." His face hardened. "I walked through the churchyard." "Why?" "I wanted to be alone." "With your shoes?" Edward's jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued. "You walked through the churchyard, then toward the quarry road. You visited this hut." "I did not." "Then perhaps the footprints belong to your shoes by coincidence." Edward looked down. His shoes matched the prints almost perfectly. Dr. Carter closed his eyes. Belle whispered, "This is becoming impossible." "No," said Miss Marple. "It is becoming clear." She pointed toward the blue scarf. "Someone wearing that scarf came here recently." Edward stared at it. "I have never seen it." "Perhaps." Miss Marple turned toward Dr. Carter. "And you?" The doctor looked confused. "What about me?" "You knew about this hut." "I did not." "Then why did you come here?" He had no answer. For the first time, Miss Marple saw fear in his eyes. But fear did not necessarily mean guilt. That was an important distinction. As the three men argued, Miss Marple quietly stepped outside. She examined the mud beside the hut. There were 4 sets of footprints. Edward's, Belle's, Dr. Carter's, and a 4th, smaller. The 4th set led away from the hut toward the railway embankment. Miss Marple followed them for several yards. Then she found something half buried beneath a stone, a brass button. On its surface were 2 engraved letters, T.R. Thomas Reed, or someone pretending to be him. Miss Marple held the button carefully in her palm. The false trail of Edward Blackwood was burning out. The real mystery lay farther down the railway line, and now Miss Marple understood something that none of the men had yet realized. Thomas Reed's greatest secret was not that he might still be alive. It was that someone had been living under his name. The false fires were dying. The true flame burned brighter. Chapter 5. The Fire Catches. The brass button lay in Miss Marple's palm, cold and strangely heavy despite its small size. The letters T.R. were unmistakable, yet she resisted the temptation to declare that it belonged to Thomas Reed. In mysteries, she knew, a name could be more dangerous than a weapon, because people often used another person's name precisely when they wished to hide their own. She returned to Blackwood Manor before sunset, carrying the button in a small envelope. The fog had thickened again, and the manor's windows glowed faintly behind the iron gates. Inside, the house was unnaturally quiet, with only the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional hiss of the gas lamps breaking the silence. Miss Marple asked to see Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. The widow received her in the library. "You have discovered something," Mrs. Blackwood said. Miss Marple smiled. "I have discovered several things. Unfortunately, they do not agree with one another." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps you should leave them alone." "That would be difficult." "Why?" "Because your husband did not." A silence followed. Miss Marple placed the envelope on the desk. "Do you recognize this?" Mrs. Blackwood looked at the button. For the first time, her composure disappeared. She reached for the chair behind her. "Where did you find that?" "At the old signalman's hut." The widow stared at her. Who was there? Mr. Bell, Dr. Carter, and Edward. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes. "Then it has begun." "What has begun?" She did not answer. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband knew Thomas Reed was not dead." The widow's face became very pale. "Yes," the word was barely audible. Miss Marple felt the fire inside the mystery suddenly flare. Why did everyone believe he was dead? Because Reginald wanted it that way. Why? Because Thomas knew what happened 10 years ago. And what happened? Mrs. Blackwood looked toward the dark window. "There was an accident at the railway." "So I have heard." "It was not an accident." Miss Marple said nothing. Mrs. Blackwood continued. "Reginald and Thomas had been business partners. They discovered that money was disappearing from one of the companies. Thomas wanted to expose the theft. Reginald wanted to conceal it. Was Reginald the thief? No. The answer came instantly. Then who? Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. The door opened. Edward Blackwood entered. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple. "Mother," she turned toward him, "your mother has just told me that Thomas Reed's death was not an accident." Edward's face went white. "You shouldn't have told her." Mrs. Blackwood looked at her son. She was going to discover it eventually. Miss Marple watched Edward carefully. "Did you know?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since yesterday." "Yet you lied to me." "I was protecting my family." "From whom?" Edward looked toward the window. "From Thomas." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Is Thomas Reed alive?" Edward did not answer. That was answer enough. A small sound came from the hallway. Someone was listening. Miss Marple turned sharply. The corridor was empty. Then she noticed the door at the far end. It was slightly open. She crossed the room. The door led to a narrow passage used by servants. At the end of it was a back entrance. The door was swinging gently in the cold air. Someone had just left. Miss Marple stepped outside. There were footprints in the mud. One pair. The same reddish clay. They led toward the garden wall, and then stopped. Someone had climbed over. Miss Marple returned to the library.
"Thomas Reed has been here."
Edward looked shocked.
"No?"
"Yes. How do you know?" "Because the person who left through that door knew we were discussing him." Mrs. Blackwood sat down. "There is something you must understand," she whispered. "What?" "Thomas Reed is not the danger." Miss Marple waited. "The danger is the person who has been pretending to be him." The room fell silent. Miss Marple looked at Edward, then at the widow. "Who?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "William Price." Miss Marple immediately remembered the name. The man who had supposedly identified Thomas Reed's body. The man who had supposedly died. The brother of Agnes Price. The two identities were beginning to overlap. "You mean William Price is alive?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "He helped Reginald hide the truth." "Why?" "Because William was the one stealing the money." Miss Marple's expression hardened. "And Thomas discovered him." "Yes." "What happened at the railway?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice trembled. "William arranged for Thomas to meet him there. Reginald followed. They fought. Thomas fell from the embankment. Was he dead? No. Then what? William found another man who had been killed in the accident and switched the identification." Miss Marple felt the final pieces beginning to connect. The body was not Thomas. No. And Thomas survived. Yes. Then where has he been? Mrs. Blackwood looked toward Edward. "Ask my son." Edward stared at the floor. Miss Marple's voice became softer. "Edward," he finally spoke, "Thomas came to me 2 weeks ago. Why? He wanted money. Blackmail?" "No." Edward looked ashamed. "He wanted justice." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And your uncle?" "Reginald knew Thomas was alive. He received the letter 3 days before his death." "What did it say?" Edward swallowed. "It said, 'You have 7 days to tell the truth, or I will.'" Miss Marple stared at him. "Then why did your uncle die before the 7 days were over?" Edward said nothing. Miss Marple looked toward the desk. "Because someone did not intend to wait 7 days." The fire in the grate crackled. Suddenly, a scream came from upstairs. Everyone froze. Mrs. Blackwood stood. "Agnes!" They rushed from the library. The housekeeper lay on the landing, unconscious. A broken vase lay beside her. Miss Marple knelt immediately. "She is breathing." Dr. Carter, who had just entered the hallway, examined her. "She has been struck." Miss Marple looked at the stairs. Someone had attacked Agnes. But why? She noticed something clenched in the housekeeper's hand. A small scrap of paper. Miss Marple carefully opened her fingers. There were only 5 words written upon it. "The wrong man died that night." Then another sound came from downstairs. The front door slammed. Edward ran toward it. Miss Marple followed, but the street outside was empty. Only fog, only silence, and on the wet pavement lay a single blue wool thread. Miss Marple picked it up. The same blue wool found near the church, the same color seen at the signalman's hut, the same thread that had been connected to the missing guest. Suddenly, she understood. The missing guest had never been missing at all. He had been watching, waiting, and now he was close enough to strike. Miss Marple looked into the fog. "The fire has caught," she whispered, and somewhere beyond the iron gates, a man's footsteps disappeared into the darkness. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. Spreading Blaze. The attack on Agnes Price changed everything. Until that moment, Miss Marple had been following a trail of old secrets, missing letters, and contradictory identities. Now, someone was willing to hurt a living person to keep those secrets buried. The fog outside Blackwood Manor pressed against the windows, while the gas lamps cast long shadows across the corridor where Agnes lay unconscious. Miss Marple stood beside her, listening as Dr. Carter carefully examined the wound. "She will recover," the doctor finally said. "The blow was serious, but not fatal." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we are fortunate." Edward Blackwood looked toward the staircase. "Who could have done this?" Miss Marple turned to him. "That is precisely what I would like to know." Edward's face was pale. "You think it was Thomas Reed?" "I think it was someone who did not want Agnes to speak." Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood sat rigidly in a chair. "You have to understand," she whispered, "that Agnes knows everything." Miss Marple looked at her. "Everything? About the railway accident, about William, about Reginald, and about Thomas." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. The fire in the drawing-room had burned low, but its remaining embers glowed red beneath the ash. Miss Marple watched them for a moment. "Secrets are rather like embers," she said quietly. "People imagine that burying them beneath ashes will extinguish them, but a little breath is enough to make them burn again." Edward looked uncomfortable. "What do you intend to do?" "Find Agnes's attacker, and then find out who killed your uncle." No one answered. Dr. Carter returned from the bedroom. "Agnes is awake." They entered together. The housekeeper lay against the pillows, her face exhausted but conscious. She looked at Miss Marple with frightened eyes. "You found the message?" "Yes." Agnes closed her eyes. "The wrong man died that night. So you wrote." "I didn't write it." Miss Marple paused. "You didn't?" Agnes shook her head. "I found it beside me." "Who attacked you?" "I don't know." "Did you see the person?" "No." "Did you hear anything?" Agnes thought carefully. "Footsteps. Man or woman?" "A man." "Anything else?" Agnes swallowed. "He smelled of tobacco." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What kind?" "I don't know." "Strong tobacco, something bitter." Dr. Carter shifted uneasily. Miss Marple noticed. "Doctor?" He looked at her. "Yes? Do you smoke?" "Occasionally." "What tobacco?" "Turkish." Miss Marple smiled. "A useful detail." Dr. Carter looked offended. "You cannot seriously suspect me because I smoke." "No, I suspect people because of what they do, not because of what they possess." She turned back to Agnes. "Did the man say anything?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Yes." "What?" He said, "You should have stayed silent." Edward stepped backward. Miss Marple noticed. "You know that voice?" "No." "You reacted." "I was frightened." "Of course." But Miss Marple was not convinced. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the village and asked Reverend Peters to send a telegram to London. She wanted information about William Price. By the following morning, the answer arrived. William Price. Left Manchester 12 years ago. No record of death. Miss Marple read it twice. So William Price had not died. The supposed identification of Thomas Reed's body had been performed by a man who had himself disappeared. The fire was spreading, but there was still one question. Who had been living under Thomas Reed's name? Miss Marple visited Clara Finch. The young secretary was frightened when she opened the door. "You shouldn't have come." "I find that people keep saying that. Someone is watching the house." "Whose house?" "Blackwood Manor." "Why?" Clara looked over her shoulder. "Because someone has been searching for the old company records." Miss Marple entered. "Where were they kept?" "In the library." "Who had access?" "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Bell, Edward, and you." "Sometimes." "Did you know about the missing money?" Clara nodded. "How much?" "Nearly £20,000. Miss Marple was silent. "That was a fortune." "Who benefited?" "That's the strange part." "What do you mean?" "The money wasn't taken all at once. Small amounts disappeared over several years, like someone avoiding detection." "Yes." "Who kept the accounts?" "Mr. Bell." Another ember. Miss Marple looked at her. Was Thomas Reed the only person who noticed? No. Who else? Clara hesitated. Reginald's wife, Mrs. Blackwood. Miss Marple's expression changed. Mrs. Blackwood knew. She suspected. And Thomas? He proved it. Then why did Reginald protect the thief? Clara lowered her voice. Because the thief knew something about him. What? I don't know. Miss Marple studied her. You do. Clara began to cry. He had a second family. Miss Marple remained silent. Mr. Blackwood had a daughter in London. Clara whispered. Who? I never learned her full name. Does she know who her father was? I don't think so. Miss Marple stood. Where did the money go? Clara wiped her eyes. To an account in London. Whose account? E. Blackwood. Miss Marple froze. Edward? No. Then who? Clara whispered. Eleanor Blackwood. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The widow had been receiving the stolen money, but that did not necessarily make her a murderer. It did, however, give her a motive for silence. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Blackwood was waiting for her. You know, the widow said. I know that money was transferred into an account in your name. Mrs. Blackwood did not deny it. I did not steal it. Then why was it there? To protect my husband's daughter. Miss Marple's eyes widened. You know who she is? Yes. Where is she? London. What is her name? Mrs. Blackwood looked toward the fire. Lucy Reed. Miss Marple stood very still. The name she had heard from Reverend Peters. Thomas Reed's daughter. But why would Reginald Blackwood have secretly supported Thomas's daughter? Unless Lucy was not merely Thomas's daughter. Miss Marple spoke slowly. Lucy is your husband's daughter. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes. Yes. The revelation hung in the room like smoke. Then Thomas discovered the affair? No. Who was Lucy's mother? Mrs. Blackwood whispered the name. Agnes Price. Miss Marple's mind raced. Agnes had been connected to William. Agnes had known the truth. Lucy was Reginald's daughter. Thomas had protected Agnes's secret. William had stolen the money. Reginald had helped conceal everything. And now someone was killing people to keep the past buried. Miss Marple suddenly understood why Agnes had been attacked. Not because she knew who killed Reginald, because she knew who Lucy really was. The door opened. Edward entered. We have a problem. What is it? The police have received a letter. From whom? Edward handed Miss Marple the envelope. There was no stamp, no address. Only 3 words written across the front, for Miss Marple. She opened it. Inside was a single sentence. Come to the old quarry at midnight if you want to meet Thomas Reed. Miss Marple looked at the clock. 11:30. The blaze had illuminated one secret after another, but the darkest shadow still remained. Thomas Reed was either alive, or someone wanted Miss Marple to believe he was. She folded the letter carefully. I shall go. Edward stared at her. Alone? Miss Marple smiled. Certainly not. Outside, the village bells began striking midnight. The blaze had spread. Every shadow was beginning to reveal what it had hidden. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. Midnight had settled over St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple reached the old quarry road. The fog was thick enough to swallow the trees, and the only sounds were the distant whistle of a train, the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes, and the occasional hiss of the gas lamp she carried. She had not come alone, despite what she had told Edward. Reverend Peters was waiting several yards behind her, while Inspector Graves of the county police had been quietly informed of the meeting. Miss Marple stopped beneath the ruined quarry arch. Someone was waiting. A man's silhouette appeared through the fog. "Miss Marple." She recognized the voice. It was Dr. Henry Carter. "You came," he said. "I received an invitation. You should not have." "That is becoming a rather repetitive warning." The doctor stepped closer. "I know who killed Reginald Blackwood." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then tell me." Dr. Carter looked toward the darkness. "Not here." A second figure emerged. It was Arthur Bell. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. "So," she said softly, "the three of us have arrived." Bell looked nervous. "Where is Edward?" "Not here." "Good. Why?" Bell swallowed. "Because he is in danger." Miss Marple's expression changed. "From whom?" Before Bell could answer, another voice came from the darkness. "From all of you." A man stepped into the moonlight. Miss Marple knew him immediately. She had never met him before, yet she knew. The eyes, the posture, the peculiar way he held his left shoulder. "Thomas Reed," she whispered. The man nodded. "Yes." For several seconds nobody spoke. Thomas looked older than the photographs Miss Marple had seen, but alive, very much alive. "You were supposed to be dead," she said. "I know. Why did you let everyone believe it?" "Because someone wanted me dead." "William Price?" Thomas's face hardened. "Yes." Miss Marple took one step forward. "Then tell me everything." Thomas looked toward the quarry. 10 years ago, I discovered that money was being stolen from Blackwood's company. I traced the payments to William Price, Agnes's brother. Yes. I confronted him. And Reginald. He knew. Did he help William? No. But he was afraid of what William would reveal. What? Thomas hesitated. Reginald had a daughter, Lucy. Thomas looked at her. "You know about Lucy?" "Yes." "Then you know more than I expected." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The embers have been glowing for some time," Thomas continued. "Lucy was Reginald's daughter with Agnes. Reginald secretly supported her financially, but he could never acknowledge her publicly because it would destroy his marriage and reputation. And William discovered the secret. Yes. He used it to blackmail Reginald." "Exactly." Miss Marple looked at Bell. "And you?" Bell lowered his head. "I helped move the money." "For William?" "No, for Lucy." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then why did the accounts appear to show Mrs. Blackwood receiving it?" "Because Eleanor was protecting Lucy." Everything began to align. The missing money, the secret daughter, the false identity, the railway accident, the missing letter. Miss Marple turned to Thomas. "What happened at the railway?" Thomas's expression darkened. "William attacked me. You fell? Yes, but survived. I woke beneath the embankment. William believed I was dead. And the body? Another man died in the accident. William arranged for it to be identified as me." Miss Marple nodded. "And then? I disappeared. Why return?" "Because Reginald finally decided to confess." "When?" 3 days before he died." Miss Marple looked at him. "You sent the letter?" "Yes, the letter saying he had 7 days." "Yes, but he died before those 7 days ended." Thomas's eyes filled with anger. "I did not kill him." Miss Marple turned toward Dr. Carter. "You performed the examination." "Yes." "Was it heart failure?" The doctor looked at Bell, then at Thomas. "No." Miss Marple's expression hardened. "What was it?" "Poison." The word seemed to freeze the air. "Digitalis," Dr. Carter continued. "A concentrated dose. Why did you certify natural death?" "I was threatened." "By whom?" Dr. Carter looked toward Bell. "By Arthur." Bell closed his eyes. Miss Marple turned to the solicitor. Why? Because I was told the police would be given evidence proving I had stolen the company money. Did you? No. Then why were you afraid? Because William had forged documents in my name. Miss Marple stood silently. Then she smiled. Mr. Bell, you have been protecting the wrong person. Bell looked confused. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Carter. What tobacco does William smoke? Cheap Turkish tobacco. Miss Marple nodded. And what did Agnes smell when she was attacked? Turkish tobacco. Thomas looked at her. Then William attacked Agnes. No, said Miss Marple. Everyone stared at her. He could have, but you don't believe he did. I believe the evidence points elsewhere. She reached into her handbag and removed the blue wool thread. This was found near the church, at the railway hut, and at Blackwood Manor. Thomas stared at it. I don't wear blue. Neither does William. Miss Marple turned toward Bell. But you do. Bell looked down at his coat. It was dark blue. His face went white. I can explain. I am sure you can. Miss Marple's voice became calm. You were at the church after the funeral. You went to the railway hut. You attacked Agnes. You sent the anonymous telegram. You arranged the meeting tonight. Bell shook his head. No. Your coat supplied the thread. That proves nothing. Your shoes carried the same red clay. Bell stepped backward. And your handwriting appears on the letter. That is impossible. Miss Marple smiled. Is it? She produced another paper. The original letter from Thomas was written with blue-black ink. The anonymous note used the same ink and the same unusual downward stroke on the letter T. But the most important clue was not the handwriting. She paused. It was the paper. Bell stared at her. Your office uses paper, watermarked with a small crown. Miss Marple held the letter up. A crown. Bell's shoulders collapsed. The game is afoot, Miss Marple said quietly. Bell looked toward Thomas. I did not mean for Reginald to die. Thomas stepped forward. But you poisoned him. Bell's voice broke. He was going to expose everything. So you killed him. I gave him the poison. Miss Marple's expression remained cold. Why blame Thomas? Because everyone already believed he was dangerous. And the missing guest? Bell looked at her. You knew Thomas would come to the funeral. Yes, and you arranged for him to appear guilty by remaining hidden. Yes, then you sent the telegram telling me he was dead. Bell said nothing. Miss Marple turned toward the others. Now we can see the entire fire. She raised one finger. First ember, Thomas Reed was supposedly dead. A second, the letter proved someone was using his name. A third, the red clay placed Edward at the church and railway hut, but it was a false trail. A fourth, the blue wool connected the crime scenes to Bell. A fifth, the Turkish tobacco sent us toward William Price. A sixth, the company records gave Bell motive. And finally, the poison death gave him opportunity. Bell looked defeated. Miss Marple's voice softened. Elementary. Thomas stared at her. You knew from the beginning. No, I suspected everyone. That is quite different. She looked toward the fog lifting over the fields. William Price was guilty of crimes 10 years ago. Thomas Reed survived them. Lucy's identity explained the missing money. But Reginald Blackwood was murdered because he intended to tell the truth. She turned to Bell. And you killed him because you feared that truth. Bell lowered his head. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance. Inspector Graves emerged from the fog with 2 constables. Arthur Bell, he said, you are under arrest for the murder of Reginald Blackwood. Bell did not resist. Thomas watched him being led away. Miss Marple stood beneath the cold moonlight. The mystery that had begun with a missing guest had ended with the discovery that the guest had never truly been missing. He had been waiting in the shadows while a murderer tried to burn every trace of the past. But truth, Miss Marple knew, was stubborn. It survived beneath ashes. It waited beneath lies. And eventually, one tiny ember was enough to set the entire darkness ablaze. The truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The first light of dawn was beginning to spread across St. Mary Mead when Inspector Graves led Arthur Bell away from the old quarry. The fog had thinned during the night, revealing the dark outlines of the hedges and bare trees, while the distant roofs of the village slowly emerged from the gray. Miss Marple stood beside the road with Thomas Reed, watching the constables place Bell inside the waiting motor car. For nearly 10 years, Bell had helped keep the truth buried. Now the truth had finally risen. Thomas looked exhausted rather than triumphant. "I thought I would feel relieved," he said. "And do you?" "No." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "Justice does not always feel like victory." Thomas nodded. Behind them, the first church bell rang. The sound traveled through the cold morning air, echoing over the village where, only days before, mourners had gathered around Reginald Blackwood's coffin. The funeral had begun everything, and now the man everyone believed dead was standing alive beneath the morning sky. By 8 o'clock, Blackwood Manor had become the center of the investigation. Inspector Graves questioned everyone separately. Edward Blackwood was the first to give his statement. He admitted that he had lied about his movements after the funeral because he had secretly met Thomas near the railway embankment. "I thought he was going to expose my uncle," Edward explained. "Why did you help him?" "Because I finally understood that my uncle's death wasn't natural." The inspector studied him. "Did you know Bell was involved?" "No." "What about your mother?" Edward hesitated. "She knew more than I did." Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood was questioned next. She admitted that she had known about Lucy for years. "Reginald wanted to acknowledge her," she said quietly, "but he was afraid of the scandal." "Was that why you argued with him the night he died?" "Yes." "What did you say?" "I told him he had waited too long." The widow lowered her eyes. "I told him that secrets destroy families." Miss Marple, standing nearby, said nothing. Mrs. Blackwood had spent years protecting a secret that had never truly belonged to her. She had protected Lucy. She had protected Reginald. And, in doing so, she had allowed William Price and Arthur Bell to use the confusion for their own purposes. There was another person whose story had not yet been heard, Agnes Price. By mid-morning, she was well enough to sit downstairs. When Thomas entered the room, Agnes stared at him. For a moment she could not speak. Then she began to cry. "Thomas," he approached her slowly. "You knew I survived." Agnes nodded. "I knew. Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because William threatened Lucy." Thomas sat beside her. "I should have come back sooner." "You couldn't." "I could have." Agnes shook her head. "You don't understand. William had people watching me." Miss Marple listened quietly. "Did William know Lucy was Reginald's daughter?" "Yes. That was his greatest weapon." Agnes nodded. "He threatened to expose her." "Why?" "Because Reginald had promised to leave Lucy money." "And did he?" "Yes." Miss Marple understood. The mysterious second beneficiary in the will was Lucy, not Eleanor, not Edward, Lucy. The entire financial mystery had been built around protecting a young woman who had never even known the full truth of her birth. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves found the revised will inside Arthur Bell's office. It confirmed everything. Reginald Blackwood had left a substantial portion of his fortune to Lucy Reed, with Eleanor appointed trustee, until Lucy reached a certain age. Edward would inherit Blackwood Manor. The will also contained a confession concerning the railway accident and William Price's financial crimes. Bell had killed Reginald because the new will would destroy the carefully constructed story that had protected him. But there was still one question. "What happened to William Price?" Edward asked. Miss Marple looked toward the window. "Perhaps that is a question for tomorrow." But Inspector Graves had already sent a telegram to London. By evening, the reply came. William Price, located in London, arrested without incident. The final shadow had begun to disappear. The village changed quickly. Rumors that had once whispered through kitchens and behind curtains now became public knowledge. The butcher knew that Belle had forged documents. The postmistress knew that Thomas Reed was alive. The vicar knew that Lucy was Reginald Blackwood's daughter. But Miss Marple noticed something else. People were already forgetting the dead man. That was perhaps the saddest part. Reginald Blackwood had been feared, respected, hated, and obeyed. Yet once the truth became known, the village no longer spoke about his wealth. They spoke about his secrets, and about the people those secrets had hurt. That evening, Miss Marple sat beside her fire. A cup of tea rested untouched beside her. The case had been solved, but her thoughts remained with Lucy. A young woman in London was about to discover that the father she had never truly known had left her an inheritance and a history. Thomas stood by the window. What will happen to Lucy? She will learn the truth. Will it hurt her? Yes. Thomas sighed. Then perhaps we should keep it from her. Miss Marple looked at him. No. Why? Because truth may hurt when it first arrives, but lies become wounds that never heal. Thomas was silent. You have spent 10 years running from the truth, Miss Marple continued. Perhaps it is time to let someone else choose what to do with it. Thomas nodded. The fire crackled. Outside, the fog had finally disappeared. For the first time since the funeral, sunlight reached the windows of Blackwood Manor. The transformation was almost complete. Edward, once suspicious and defensive, had begun cooperating fully with the police. Eleanor, once trapped by secrecy, had decided to write to Lucy herself. Agnes, once terrified of William Price, no longer needed to hide. Thomas, once a ghost living under another man's death certificate, could finally return to his own name. And Lucy, though she did not yet know it, would soon inherit not merely money but the truth. As for Miss Marple, she had changed very little. She still looked like an elderly village woman with knitting in her lap and a gentle smile. But Inspector Graves had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the quiet observer. He visited her cottage that evening. I owe you an apology, he said. For what? For assuming the missing guest was irrelevant. Miss Marple smiled. He was never irrelevant. You knew? I suspected. Isn't that the same thing? Not at all. The inspector laughed. Miss Marple looked into the fire. Facts are important, Inspector, but so are the little things people overlook. The embers. She nodded. Exactly. The inspector stood. Then what was the most important clue? Miss Marple considered the question. The missing guest. But Thomas was alive. Yes? So his absence was a clue. Precisely. She smiled. Everyone at the funeral asked why Thomas wasn't there. They assumed his absence meant he was hiding. And what did you think? I thought the opposite. The inspector frowned. Miss Marple explained. A murderer does not usually want the missing person to be remembered. Yet someone had deliberately included Thomas Reed's name on the funeral arrangements. So Belle wanted us to notice him. Yes. Why? Because he wanted everyone looking for Thomas instead of looking at himself. The inspector stared at her. And that was the beginning? No. Miss Marple looked at the dying fire. The beginning was the fact that everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The final ember glowed beneath the ash. Miss Marple gently closed the curtains. Outside, St. Mary Mead was settling into a peaceful evening. The case was over. The murderer was in custody. The innocent had been cleared. And from the ashes of an old lie, justice had finally risen. Justice rose from the ashes, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers Cool. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral of Reginald Blackwood, and St. Mary Mead had slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The fog still visited the village on cold mornings, gas lamps still flickered along the narrow lanes, and the church bell still marked the hours with solemn certainty, but the atmosphere had changed. The whispers that had once followed every mention of Blackwood Manor had faded, replaced by ordinary village concerns, weather, gardens, tea, and the latest disagreement over the parish accounts. Miss Marple noticed these things from her window. Villages, she reflected, were rather like fires. They could blaze fiercely when fed with gossip, suspicion, and fear, but once the truth was known, the flames usually died quickly. The embers remained, but they no longer threatened to burn the house down. Arthur Bell had been formally charged with the murder of Reginald Blackwood. William Price had also been arrested in London and was facing charges relating to fraud, forgery, and his part in the railway deception 10 years earlier. Dr. Henry Carter had admitted that he had falsified the original death certificate under pressure, though the evidence suggested he had not known Bell intended to murder Blackwood. Edward Blackwood had been cleared of suspicion, and perhaps most importantly, Thomas Reed was alive. He had returned to St. Mary Mead under his own name. Miss Marple encountered him one afternoon outside the church. "You look different," she said. Thomas smiled. "I feel different. 10 years is a long time to live as a ghost." It was. And now? He looked toward the churchyard. "Now I can finally stop running." Miss Marple nodded. "Good." Thomas hesitated. "Do you think people will forgive me?" "That depends upon what you did." "I lied about my identity." "To survive." "Yes." "Then perhaps they will understand." Thomas smiled faintly. "I have one person to thank." "Lucy?" He nodded. Lucy had arrived from London several days earlier. She had been shocked when Eleanor Blackwood told her the truth, but she had not rejected it. Instead, she had spent long hours reading the letters Reginald had written but never sent. Miss Marple had seen her once. The young woman had been standing beside the manor garden, holding an old photograph. She had not looked happy, but she had looked peaceful. That was progress. Inside Blackwood Manor, Edward had begun making changes. The old library, once filled with locked drawers and secret documents, was being renovated. The heavy curtains had been removed, allowing sunlight to enter. The old desk where Reginald had hidden his papers remained, but the locked compartments had been opened. Edward had discovered that the house felt different without secrets. "It is quieter," he told Miss Marple. "Isn't that strange?" "Yes, not really. Secrets make a great deal of noise, even when nobody speaks." Edward smiled. He had changed considerably. The arrogant young heir who had hurried away from his uncle's funeral now seemed older, though only a few weeks had passed. He had learned that inheritance was not merely money. It was responsibility. He also learned that loyalty to family did not mean protecting every family secret. Sometimes, Miss Marple thought, loyalty meant having the courage to expose the truth. One afternoon, Edward brought her a small box. Inside was the brass button marked TR. "I thought you should have it." Miss Marple looked at it. "No." "Why not?" "Because it belongs to the past." She closed the box and handed it back. "You keep it." "What for?" "To remind yourself." "Of what?" "That small things matter." Edward smiled. "I think I understand now." Miss Marple looked toward the fire. "Do you?" "Yes." He paused. "Your clue wasn't really the button, was it?" "No." "The blue thread?" "No." "The clay?" "No." Edward laughed. "Then what was it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Human nature." He shook his head. "That sounds rather complicated." "It is actually very simple." She explained that every person in the mystery had behaved according to a recognizable pattern. Bell controlled information because he was afraid of losing control. William used fear because intimidation was his method. Dr. Carter obeyed threats because he valued his reputation. Eleanor protected secrets because she believed silence could protect the innocent. Thomas disappeared because survival mattered more than justice. Edward lied because he thought family loyalty required it. And Lucy, who knew none of the truth, had been the only person without a motive to deceive. "The cleverest clue," Miss Marple said, "was the person who had no reason to lie." Edward nodded slowly. "I never thought of that. Most people don't." That evening, Miss Marple visited Agnes Price. The housekeeper was preparing tea. She looked healthier now, though the fear that had once lived in her eyes had disappeared. "Have you heard from William?" Miss Marple asked. "No." "Good." Agnes placed a cup before her. "Lucy came to see me." "How did it go?" "She asked whether I was her mother." Miss Marple waited. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." Agnes smiled sadly. "She cried." "Of course. But afterward she hugged me." Miss Marple smiled. "That is rather important." Yes. For 10 years, Agnes had feared the truth. Now she understood something. The truth had not destroyed her daughter. The lie had. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple walked home through the village. The autumn leaves had turned brown and gold. Smoke rose from chimneys. A handsome cab passed along the road, its wheels rattling against the stones. Somewhere, a shopkeeper was pulling down his shutters. The ordinary sounds of life had returned. She paused near the churchyard. The grave of Reginald Blackwood was covered with fresh flowers. No monument had been erected yet. Perhaps none was needed. Miss Marple stood there for a moment. She did not forgive him. She did not condemn him. She simply remembered. A man had created secrets. Other people had protected them. A murderer had tried to bury them, and one missing guest had brought them back to the surface. Miss Marple turned away. The case was finished. But as she reached the church gate, she noticed something on the ground. A small envelope. Her name was written upon it. Miss Marple. For one moment, she wondered whether another mystery had begun. Then she opened it. Inside was a short note from Lucy. "Thank you for finding the truth." Miss Marple smiled. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside her handbag. The mystery had ended. No murderer remained hidden. No innocent person remained accused. And no missing guest remained missing. The fire had burned itself out. Only the warmest embers remained. Miss Marple walked home as evening settled over St. Mary Mead. The church bell chimed 6. The sound traveled softly through the cooling air. Behind her, the village lights began to glow one by one. Peace had returned. And Miss Marple, who knew better than most that another secret would eventually emerge from some quiet cottage or respectable drawing room, was content to let the evening remain peaceful. For now, the embers cooled at last. London breathed easier, and St. Mary Mead returned to peace. Chapter 10. By the fire at Miss Marple's cottage. The winter evening had settled gently over St. Mary Mead, and for once there was no mystery hanging over the village. A warm fire crackled in Miss Marple's sitting room, filling the cottage with the comforting scent of coal smoke and tea. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, while the occasional wheels of a passing motor car disturbed the silence before disappearing into the darkness. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, knitting quietly. Across from her sat Reverend Peters. On the small table between them lay the final report concerning Reginald Blackwood's murder. Arthur Bell had confessed. William Price was awaiting trial. Dr. Carter had been cleared of involvement in the murder. Thomas Reed had finally returned to his own life. And Lucy had learned the truth about her father. The mystery was finished, or so it appeared. "I still find it extraordinary," Reverend Peters said, "that everything began with a man who was not at the funeral." Miss Marple smiled. "That was the important part." "The missing guest?" "Yes. I thought the murderer was the important part." The murderer was only the answer. She placed another stitch in her knitting. The question came first. Reverend Peters looked thoughtful. "You knew Thomas was alive?" "No. But you suspected." "I suspected that someone wanted us to believe he was dead." She looked toward the fire. "That distinction matters." The flames shifted, throwing moving shadows across the walls. Miss Marple had often thought that a mystery was rather like a dark room. People entered it carrying assumptions, and those assumptions became obstacles. The investigator's task was not always to find something hidden. Sometimes it was simply to notice what everyone else had decided not to see. In the Blackwood case, the first ember had been Thomas Reed's absence. Everyone had assumed that because he was not at the funeral, he must have been dead or frightened. But Miss Marple had asked a simpler question. Why had everyone expected him to come? That question had opened the door. Then came the letter. The vanished letter had seemed important because it contained Thomas Reed's threat. But the more important fact was that Reginald Blackwood had kept it. A guilty man might destroy a threatening letter. A frightened man might hide it. But Reginald had kept it because he had intended to answer. That told Miss Marple that he had been preparing to confess. Then came the red clay. The clay had seemed to implicate Edward Blackwood. Yet Edward had not been the murderer. It was a false ember. Miss Marple smiled. People often become excited when they find a clue that points directly toward someone. Reverend Peters nodded. Because it seems conclusive. Exactly. But you didn't trust it. No. Why? Because real life is rarely so tidy. She leaned back. The red clay told us where Edward had been. It did not tell us why. That had been the crucial distinction. Then came the blue wool thread. That clue had been more useful because it appeared in several places. The church, the railway hut, Blackwood Manor. 3 locations connected by one small detail. A thread, tiny, almost meaningless. Yet it eventually led to Arthur Bell. Miss Marple looked into the fire. That is why I call them embers. Because they are small, yes. And they become important when connected. Precisely. A single ember does not illuminate a room, but enough embers can become a fire. And enough facts, when properly connected, can become the truth. Reverend Peters smiled. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Was it simple while you were solving it? Miss Marple laughed softly. Not at all. She thought about the many possibilities she had considered. Edward could have killed his uncle. Eleanor could have killed her husband. Dr. Carter could have poisoned him. Thomas could have returned seeking revenge. William Price could have returned from the past. Arthur Bell could have been protecting someone. Each possibility had to be examined. Each had to be tested. And several had to be discarded. That was the nature of deduction. People sometimes imagined that solving a mystery meant having one brilliant idea. It rarely did. It meant collecting dozens of small observations and refusing to allow emotion to decide which ones mattered. The criminal, meanwhile, made one mistake after another. Bell had relied upon assumptions. He assumed everyone would believe Thomas was dead. He assumed the old railway story would remain unquestioned. He assumed Dr. Carter would remain silent. He assumed Edward would protect his family. He assumed Eleanor would protect Lucy. And most importantly, he assumed Miss Marple was harmless. That had been his greatest mistake. The criminal mind, Miss Marple said, often believes that intelligence is the same as control. Reverend Peters looked at her. And it isn't? No. Then what is intelligence? Miss Marple considered the question. Knowing what you do not know. The fire crackled. That is why observation matters. If you decide too quickly, you stop seeing. You begin looking only for evidence that proves your first idea. She glanced toward the rain-streaked window. And that is how people are deceived. Reverend Peters nodded slowly. You have taught me something tonight. I hope so. Outside, the village was quiet. St. Mary Mead had survived another scandal, another secret, another death. But Miss Marple knew that human nature would not change. There would always be greed, jealousy, fear, love, shame, ambition. And people would continue making the same mistakes in different houses and different generations. That was why old village stories were so useful. The names changed, the clothes changed, the technology changed. But people remained remarkably familiar. A jealous wife in one village might behave much like a jealous wife in another. A dishonest solicitor might resemble a dishonest businessman. A frightened servant might keep the same secrets whether she lived in a grand manor or a tiny cottage. Human nature left fingerprints everywhere. The trick was noticing them. Reverend Peters stood and put on his coat. I should go. Miss Marple nodded. "Good night, Reverend." He reached the door, then he turned. "One final question." "Yes?" "If another mystery comes to St. Mary Mead, will you investigate it?" Miss Marple smiled. "I hope not." The Reverend laughed. "So do I." He left. Miss Marple returned to her chair. The fire had burned low. Only a few glowing embers remained beneath the ash. She stirred them gently with the poker. A tiny flame appeared, then another. She smiled. The case of the missing funeral guest had begun with an absence. It had ended with truth. The dead man had not been murdered for his money alone. He had been murdered because he was finally ready to reveal what others had spent 10 years hiding. Thomas Reed had been erased from the records. William Price had exploited a false death. Arthur Bell had built a wall of lies around the truth. But none of them had counted on one thing: observation, a missing name, a piece of clay, a thread of blue wool, a strange smell of tobacco, a letter, a frightened servant, a reluctant doctor, a widow protecting a secret. Each was insignificant by itself. Together, they became a blaze. Miss Marple watched the final ember glow. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Lies did not usually collapse because someone discovered one enormous truth. They collapsed because small truths accumulated until the lie could no longer support itself. The world was full of obvious things which people failed to notice. A missing guest, a trembling hand, a muddy shoe, a torn letter, a thread caught upon a coat. The careful observer saw them, the careless observer dismissed them, and somewhere between those two approaches lay the difference between mystery and truth. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The fire warmed the room. The rain softened outside. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully. For tonight, there were no footsteps outside the window, no anonymous telegram, no secret letter, no missing guest, only the quiet ticking of the clock and the gentle breathing of the dying fire. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. She smiled to herself. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day. At least, she hoped so, for mysteries never truly disappeared. They simply waited, in a locked drawer, behind a polite smile, inside an old letter, or perhaps at the funeral of someone everyone believed they understood. The final ember dimmed. Miss Marple looked toward the fire one last time. "Truth," she murmured, "always leaves a little light behind." And outside, beyond the darkened windows, St. Mary Mead slept beneath the stars. Until the next mystery, until the next ember glows.